Hey guys, tonight we're spending some time with one of the most unsettling cases in modern American criminal history. The story of Israel Keyes. This is a case that doesn't follow the patterns we've come to expect from serial killer investigations. There was no victim profile, no geographic anchor, no signature that a profiler could trace. Keyes was something the FBI's own behavioral analysis unit admitted they had never quite seen before. A man who buried weapons in the forests of states he wouldn't return to for years. A man who flew across the country, rented a car, and drove hundreds of miles just to find someone he had never met in a town he had no connection to. And for over a decade, nobody knew he existed. Before we settle in for this one, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely find value in what we do here. No pressure. And thank you so much to everyone who suggested this case. It's one that has been requested many, many times, and it deserves to be told carefully. Now, dim those lights. Get comfortable. This is a long one. And the people in this story, the ones whose names should be remembered long after the name of the man who hurt them fades from memory, they deserve to be heard. Because behind the FBI timelines and the interrogation transcripts and the evidence photos, there were real people. A young woman in Anchorage who dreamed of becoming a Navy nurse and who made coffee for strangers on dark winter evenings because she understood that the life she wanted required work and she was willing to put it in. A quiet couple in Vermont who liked to stay home with their pets and who chose each other every day in the simple, steady way that people do when they found something worth holding on to. A woman in New Jersey who went about her morning one April day without any idea that her life was about to intersect with something monstrous. And somewhere out there, as many as 8 other people whose families may still be wondering what happened to them, whose cases sit in filing cabinets across the country, growing cold but never forgotten by the people who love them. Have you ever wondered how someone could move through the entire country for more than a decade, taking lives at random and leave almost no trace? How could the usual tools of criminal investigation, profiling, pattern analysis, geographic mapping fail so completely against one person? And what does it mean that even now, years after his death, we still don't know the full scope of what he did? Let's start from the beginning. And for this story, the beginning isn't with the killer. It's with the people he took from us. You're in Anchorage, Alaska, in the winter of 2012. It's early February. The sun barely clears the mountains before it starts sinking again. And by late afternoon, the light has that thin, blue quality that makes everything feel like it's holding its breath. The temperature hovers around 10 degrees. The roads are packed with ice. And along Tudor Road, in a small espresso stand called Common Grounds, an 18-year-old named Samantha Koenig is working the evening shift. If you've ever been to Anchorage, you know the espresso stands that line the roadsides. They're everywhere in Alaska, little drive-up kiosks barely bigger than a garden shed, where one person works alone for hours, serving coffee through a small window to customers in idling cars. In a city where winter darkness stretches through most of the day and temperatures drop well below zero for weeks at a time, these stands become something more than just a place to get caffeine. They're a point of human contact, a reason to roll down your window and say hello to someone. Samantha Koenig worked at one of these stands. She was born on August 30th, 1993 to James and Darlene Koenig. She grew up in Anchorage with a big family around her. 2 brothers, Travis and Alex, and 3 sisters, Tonya, Kaylee, and Micah. By all accounts, she was the kind of young woman who drew people in. She was warm, she was determined. She had the kind of personality that made people feel noticed. She had attended West High School and a Vale High School and was working to save money because she had big plans. Samantha wanted to enlist in the Navy and train as a nurse. It wasn't an idle daydream. She had already held jobs at Subway and at the House of Harley before taking the barista position at Common Grounds. She understood what it meant to work towards something. She kept 2 pets she adored, a dog named Mulisha and a cat named Sheba. The kind of small details that remind you she was a real person with a real life. Someone who came home after a shift and curled up on the couch with animals that loved her back. She was in a relationship with a young man named Dwayne Tortolani, who was supposed to pick her up from work that night. They had probably texted each other earlier in the day about the plan, maybe about what they'd do afterward, maybe about nothing in particular. The ordinary, forgettable communications of 2 young people who assumed they had all the time in the world. Samantha Koenig was 18 years old. She had her whole life mapped out in the way that 18-year-olds do, with big ambitions and the kind of energy that makes you believe you'll get there. She served coffee to strangers on dark winter evenings. She made plans with her boyfriend. She texted her dad she was someone's daughter, someone's sister, someone's girlfriend. She was a person, not a headline, and it matters that we understand that before we understand what happened to her. A family friend named Michelle Tasker would later describe the night Samantha disappeared. She went to work that day expecting to go home. Tasker said, going to her boyfriend and her dad. Multiple calls went unanswered. Her boyfriend's cell phone eventually lit up with a text from Samantha's phone, but it was not Samantha who had sent it. In the weeks that followed, the community of Anchorage rallied around the Koenig family. People donated to a reward fund that eventually exceeded $70,000. They held vigils. They shared her photo. They believed she was still alive somewhere, being held by someone who could be persuaded to let her go if enough money was raised. That hope was deliberate. It was manufactured by the man who had taken her. And it was false. Let's talk about Bill and Lorraine Currier. Bill Currier was 50 years old. His wife, Lorraine, was 55. They lived in a quiet ranch-style house in Essex, Vermont, a small town just east of Burlington, where the pace of life is measured and the neighbors know each other by name. Essex is the kind of place where people wave when they pass you on the sidewalk, where the local diner fills up on Saturday mornings with the same regulars, and where a missing couple makes the front page of every newspaper within 100 miles. Bill and Lorraine were what people sometimes call homebodies, and they meant it as a compliment. They preferred evenings at home with their pets over going out. Bill worked for a local moving company, and Lorraine worked at a hospital. They had been together for years, and theirs was the kind of relationship that doesn't generate drama or gossip. It was stable. It was quiet. It was good. The kind of love that doesn't make for exciting stories, but makes for a life worth living. Their home on a residential street in Essex was modest, with a simple floor plan and an attached garage. The yard was ordinary. The neighborhood was safe. There was nothing about the Curriers' lives that would have drawn anyone's attention, and that was exactly how they liked it. They had built something small and warm and theirs, and every evening they came home to it. You're standing on their street in early June of 2011. It's a beautiful time of year in Vermont. The trees are fully leafed. The lawns are bright green. Kids are riding bicycles down the block. You can hear someone mowing a lawn a few houses away. The Curriers are probably inside right now. Bill watching television. Lorraine feeding one of the pets. Both of them settling into the simple rhythm of a weeknight at home. There is nothing to suggest that tonight will be any different from any other night. On the evening of June the 8th, 2011, Bill and Lorraine Currier were last seen at their home. The next morning, neither of them showed up to work. That was unusual. That was the kind of thing that immediately raised alarms because the Curriers were reliable people. They did not miss work. Family members reported them missing. Inside their house, investigators found signs that something had gone terribly wrong. The couple had not left voluntarily. Their beds had been slept in. Their car was gone. Their lives had been interrupted in the middle of the night by something sudden and violent. Bill and Lorraine Currier's bodies have never been found. That sentence is worth sitting with for a moment. Their family has never been able to bury them. There was no funeral with a casket. There was no grave to visit. There is an absence where closure should be, and it has been there since June of 2011. By all accounts, they were friendly, peaceful, good people who encountered a force of pure evil acting at random. U.S. Attorney Tristram Coffin would later say of the Curriers, and that phrase, a force of pure evil acting at random, would become one of the defining descriptions of this case, because nothing the Curriers did in their personal lives contributed to what happened to them. They were chosen because their house was on a quiet street, because the floor plan suggested no children lived there, and because a man passing through Vermont happened to drive past their home on a night when he'd already decided to kill someone. There's also a fourth person investigators believe was taken by Israel Keyes. Her name was Debra Feldman. She was 49 years old and lived in Hackensack, New Jersey. Debra was last seen alive on April 8, 2009, at her home. She vanished without explanation, and for years, her disappearance remained a mystery. After Keyes was captured in 2012, he told investigators that in April 2009, he had taken a woman in New Jersey and buried her body near Tupper Lake in upstate New York. The FBI has said they have relative confidence that this victim was Debra Feldman, though her remains have never been recovered. What we know about Debra's disappearance is heartbreakingly sparse. She was there one day and gone the next. Her neighbors didn't report hearing anything unusual. Her belongings were left behind in the way that suggests a person expected to return. There was no note, no fight, no financial trouble that would explain a voluntary disappearance. Just a woman who went about her life in a New Jersey suburb and then, one spring day, was no longer there. Her case lingered as one of those unsolved disappearances that local law enforcement works on for a while, and then, when all leads are exhausted, files away. It was not until Keyes began talking to the FBI 3 years later, from a jail cell 4,000 miles away in Alaska, that the first real thread connecting her disappearance to a specific person emerged. And even then, the connection remains unconfirmed because the one person who could identify her with certainty killed himself before the investigation was complete. And then, there are the others, the ones we cannot name. Keyes told investigators he murdered a couple in Washington state sometime between 2001 and 2005. He refused to say whether they were married or what their relationship was. He said they were buried near a valley. He may have moved their vehicle to create distance between where it was found and where the crime took place. He admitted to killing 2 more people in Washington state, independently of one another. In either 2005 or 2006, he used his boat to dispose of at least one of the bodies, sinking it in more than 100 feet of water in Lake Crescent in Olympic National Park, using anchors to keep it down. That is at least 4 people in Washington alone whose names we may never know. 4 people who had lives and families and routines, who went somewhere one day and never came back, and whose loved ones may still be waiting. And beyond those, Keyes hinted at still more. The FBI believes the total number of his victims may be 11. When he died, investigators found beneath his body in his jail cell a series of drawings, 11 skulls, rendered in his own blood, each with an inverted crucifix. Investigators believe each skull represented a victim, 11 people, 3 identified, 8 who remain unknown. And that, more than anything, is what makes this case so deeply disturbing. Not just what happened to the people we can name, but the possibility that there are families out there, right now, who have never received an answer, who filed a missing person report years ago and are still checking their phones, still hoping, still carrying a grief that has never been given a shape. This case is about them, all of them, the ones we know and the ones we don't, and it deserves to be told with that in mind, which brings us to the man responsible. And to understand how he became what he was, we need to go back a long way to a 1-room cabin in the woods of eastern Washington without electricity or running water, where a young boy was growing up in the kind of isolation that most people can barely imagine. Israel Keyes was born on January 7, 1978, in a small community near Richmond, Utah. He was the second of 10 children. His parents, Heidi and John Jeffrey Keyes, held deep suspicions of the government, modern medicine, and public education. All 10 of their children were born at home, without medical assistance. All of them were homeschooled. The family was, at different points, affiliated with the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, though their beliefs would shift dramatically in the years to come. When Israel was around 3 to 5 years old, the family relocated to a remote stretch of land north of Colville, Washington, along Aladdin Road. Colville is a small town in Stevens County, in the northeastern corner of the state, surrounded by forests and farmland and the kind of open, empty landscape where a family can disappear from the broader world entirely. The nearest substantial city is Spokane, about 70 miles to the south. Drive north from Colville and you're heading toward the Canadian border through miles of nothing but pine forest and logging roads. It's beautiful country, but it's lonely country. And for a child growing up there without connection to the outside world, the loneliness could become all-consuming. And that is more or less what the Keyes family did. They disappeared. To understand what that kind of disappearance means for a child, you have to understand what Colville was in the early 1980s and what the land around it felt like. Stevens County is bigger than the state of Rhode Island, and in the early 80s, it had a population of around 30,000 people spread across that entire area. Most of the economy was logging and farming. The towns were small. The spaces between them were enormous. And if you drove far enough north along the unpaved roads, past the last mailboxes and the last power lines, you entered a world that looked and felt like it had been left behind by the 20th century entirely. That is where the Keyes family planted themselves, not on the outskirts of Colville, not in a rural neighborhood with distant neighbors, but deep in the timber country along Aladdin Road, where the nearest house might be a quarter mile through the trees and where the silence at night was total. They moved into a one-room cabin. There was no electricity, no running water. During parts of the year, the children slept in tents outside the cabin and earned money by cutting firewood or working on neighboring farms. There was no television, no telephone, no radio. The family's only window to the wider world was the small community around them. And that community included some deeply troubling influences. Now picture this cabin and this family in the mountains of eastern Washington in the early 1980s. Snow piled on the roof in winter, muddy roads in spring, the sound of nothing but wind through ponderosa pines and the occasional crack of a rifle in the distance. The nearest town is small. The nearest neighbor, for a time, was the family of Chevy Kehoe, who would later be convicted of 3 murders in 1996 and tied to white supremacist violence. The Keyes family attended a church called the Ark, which taught Christian identity theology, a belief system steeped in anti-Semitism and racial hatred. They also attended the Christian Covenant Church. Whether Israel fully absorbed these ideologies as a child is difficult to say, but he was immersed in them during his most formative years, in a world where extremism was not the exception, but the norm. Christian identity theology, for those unfamiliar, is not a fringe interpretation of mainstream Christianity. It is a racist belief system that teaches white Europeans are the true descendants of the biblical Israelites, that Jewish people are descendants of Satan, and that non-white races are subhuman. It is the theological backbone of numerous white supremacist and domestic terrorist organizations in the United States. The churches the Keyes family attended were steeped in this worldview, and the community around them reinforced it. Chevy Kehoe, who lived nearby and attended many of the same gatherings, would go on to murder a family of 3, including an 8-year-old girl, as part of a plan to establish a white separatist state in the Pacific Northwest. He was convicted of those murders in 1999. This was the social world that young Israel Keyes inhabited. Not a world of playground friendships and birthday parties and soccer practice, but a world of armed survivalism, biblical literalism, racial hatred, and deep suspicion of everyone outside the immediate community. The family's faith was not gentle. It was fearful and punitive. Sin was discussed constantly. Discipline was harsh, and the outside world was painted as a corrupting influence that would destroy the family if they allowed it in. The isolation of this upbringing is difficult to overstate. These children had almost no exposure to the social structures that most of us take for granted. Schools where you learn to navigate relationships with peers, communities where norms of behavior are reinforced by observation, media that at least gives you a map of what the broader culture considers acceptable or unacceptable. The Keyes children grew up in a moral and social vacuum, with a family ideology rooted in suspicion, separatism, and a fundamentalist interpretation of religion that drew hard lines between the righteous and the damned. Israel was, by most accounts, a strange and unsettling child. A girl who knew him during this period would later say that he made her skin crawl. He developed an early fascination with guns and hunting. He would break into neighbors' homes to steal firearms. He shot at anything that moved, birds, rodents, whatever he could find. He set fires in the surrounding woodlands, and he tortured animals. The animal cruelty is worth pausing on. because it is one of the most well-documented predictors of future violence against humans, and in Keyes' case, it was not casual or impulsive. He tied a family cat to a tree and wounded it with a .22 revolver while a friend watched in horror. He later bragged about skinning a deer while it was still alive. When asked by investigators years later about his early interests, he said simply, "I would hunt anything with a heartbeat." By his teenage years, Keyes had also become a skilled carpenter, building his first wooden cabin at age 16. He worked for a local contractor in Colville from 1995 to 1997. He kept a journal during this period in which he recorded biblical quotations alongside lists of daily sins he felt ashamed of, including lust. This is a detail that speaks to the internal contradictions of his upbringing, the rigid moral framework imposed by his parents sitting alongside the violent impulses that were already taking shape beneath the surface. At some point in his teenage years, Israel Keyes renounced Christianity. He declared himself an atheist. His parents, who had raised him in a world where faith was the foundation of everything, responded by evicting him from the household. They told his younger siblings, many of whom looked up to him, to cut off all contact. Whatever fragile connection Israel had to his family was severed in that moment. Imagine being 16 or 17 years old and being told by your own parents that you are no longer welcome in the only home you have ever known, that your brothers and sisters, the children you grew up sharing a single room with, are forbidden from speaking to you, that the community you were raised in, however small and insular it may have been, has decided you no longer belong. For a young person who had never attended a school, never had a friendship outside the family's tight circle, never learned how to exist in the broader world, this expulsion would have been catastrophic. Not because the family was healthy, it clearly was not, but because it was the only social structure Israel Keyes had ever known, and losing it meant losing the last thread of connection to any kind of normal human development. He was alone, he was angry, and he had spent his entire childhood in an environment that had taught him to view the outside world as an enemy. After that, his interests shifted. He became drawn to Satanism. He later told investigators that he had planned to commit a ritualistic murder, and in the summer of 1997 or 1998, in Maupin, Oregon, where the family had briefly relocated, he acted on his darkest impulses for the first time. A teenage girl had been tubing with friends on the Deschutes River. Keyes stalked her from a tree line. He approached her with a knife, separated her from her group, and violently sexually assaulted her. He had intended to kill her as part of what he described as a satanic ritual. The girl pleaded with him, promised she wouldn't tell anyone, and somehow she convinced him to let her go. He put her back on the river tube he had taken her from and disappeared. He later told FBI investigators, "I wasn't violent enough. I made up my mind I was never going to let that happen again." That girl survived. She was likely between 14 and 18 years old. Her identity has never been publicly disclosed, but she was the first person to experience what Israel Keyes was becoming, and her survival came down to her own courage and presence of mind in a moment of unimaginable terror. Have you ever thought about what it must have been like for her years later, when the news broke about who Israel Keyes was and what he had done? To realize that the person who attacked you on a summer afternoon by a river in Oregon had gone on to kill at least 11 people. That you were the only one he ever let go. After this assault, the Keyes family moved again. this time to Smyrna, Maine, near an Amish community where they collected sap for maple syrup production. But Israel did not stay with them. He was already untethered from his family, from community, from the structures that keep most people grounded. In July of 1998, at the age of 20, Israel Keyes enlisted in the United States Army. He entered at a recruiting station in Albany, New York. He was assigned to Alpha Company, 1st Battalion, 5th Infantry Regiment. He was stationed at Fort Hood in Texas, Fort Lewis in Washington, and in the Sinai Peninsula in Egypt. He completed Army Rangers training. He earned an Army Achievement Medal, a Marksman Badge with Rifle Bar, an Expert Infantryman Badge, and an Air Assault Badge. By any outward measure, he was a competent, disciplined soldier. But the people who served with him noticed things. He was quiet. He kept to himself during the week and drank heavily on weekends, consuming entire bottles of Wild Turkey bourbon. He had large posters of the band Insane Clown Posse hanging in his barracks room. He once confessed to a fellow soldier that he had the desire to kill him. The soldier reportedly took it as an unsettling joke. It may not have been one. He later told investigators that he enjoyed the survival skills training the Army provided, and that during his time in service, he began to actively fantasize about killing strangers. On July 8, 2001, Israel Keyes was honorably discharged from the Army at the rank of specialist. He was 23 years old. He moved to Near Bay, Washington, a small community on the Maka Reservation, at the very tip of the Olympic Peninsula, where he had begun a relationship with a woman he'd met online. In 2000, they had a daughter together. The transition from military to civilian life is difficult for many veterans. For Keyes, it appears to have been seamless in the worst possible way. He carried the discipline and the skill set of a trained soldier into the civilian world, but without the structure, the oversight, and the daily accountability that military life provides. He knew how to move through unfamiliar terrain. He knew how to navigate by map. He knew how to survive in the wilderness for extended periods. He knew firearms intimately, and he had no one watching him, no commanding officer, no chain of command, no one to report to. He was a trained, capable, patient young man with violent fantasies he had been nurturing since adolescence, and for the first time in his adult life, he was completely free to act on them. And this is where the killing is believed to have started. To be fair to the investigators who would eventually try to piece all of this together, Keyes gave them very little to work with regarding his earliest murders. He spoke in fragments and riddles. He withheld names and locations. He seemed to enjoy the control that information gave him, even from a jail cell. But here is what we know, and this is where the story shifts into something much darker. To understand what made Israel Keyes so difficult to catch, you need to understand how he thought about murder. Because unlike most serial killers who develop a pattern that eventually becomes their undoing, Keyes treated killing the way a special operations soldier might treat a covert mission. Every variable was controlled. Every risk was calculated. Every connection between himself and his crimes was deliberately severed before the crime even took place. The centerpiece of his method was the murder kit. Years before he planned to kill in a specific area, Keyes would travel there and bury a cache of supplies in a remote location. He described this process to investigators in detail during his interrogation, and the picture that emerges is of someone who approached premeditated violence with the same discipline and forward planning that a long-distance backpacker might apply to resupplying stations along a trail. The caches were carefully assembled and packed into waterproof containers, typically 5-gallon plastic buckets from Home Depot, the kind you can buy at any hardware store in America for a few dollars. He chose these buckets specifically because they were watertight, durable, and unremarkable. If someone stumbled across one in the woods, it would look like nothing more than a piece of discarded construction equipment. Inside, investigators would later find a variety of items, each chosen for a specific purpose. Weapons, including disassembled firearms and homemade silencers that could be assembled on site. Ammunition, zip ties, the heavy-duty kind used in construction, not the small ones from an office supply store. Duct tape, rope, shovels for burial, and chemicals designed to accelerate the decomposition of human remains, including Drano and lye. The chemicals were there for a practical reason. A body that decomposes faster is harder to identify through DNA analysis or dental records. He buried these kits in places he knew he would return to at some point. Along rural roads in remote areas of Alaska, near trailheads in the Adirondack Mountains of upstate New York, in the forests of Washington state, near the Bonnet Carré Spillway outside New Orleans, possibly near Green River, Wyoming, possibly near Port Angeles, Washington, on the Olympic Peninsula. Some were near lakes where bodies could be submerged. Some were beneath rocks along riverbanks. Some were in areas so remote that the chances of a hiker or hunter stumbling across them were almost non-existent. The logic behind the caches was precise and methodical. Think about it from a criminal's perspective for a moment. The most dangerous thing a killer can do, from an investigative standpoint, is create connections between themselves and the location of a crime in the days and hours immediately before and after the crime takes place. Every purchase, every credit card transaction, every cell tower ping, every piece of surveillance footage creates a potential link. A man who buys zip ties at a Walmart in Burlington, Vermont on June 7th, and then a couple disappears from Burlington on June 8th, has created a connection that any detective could follow. Keyes eliminated that connection by separating the acquisition of supplies from the commission of the crime by years. If he buried a cache in Vermont in 2009 and used it in 2011, there was no purchase to trace, no store surveillance footage to review, no receipt to discover. The supplies were already in the ground, paid for in cash months or years earlier, in a different state, with no connection to anyone who might go missing in the future. If he flew to a city to commit a crime, he would not need to buy weapons locally. He would not need to carry weapons through airport security, which would have flagged him immediately. He would not need to use a credit card at a hardware store in the same state where a person had just gone missing. Everything was already there, waiting, sometimes for years before he returned, for them. The FBI recovered 2 of these caches after his arrest, guided by information Keyes provided during his interrogation. One was buried along Eagle River Road in Alaska, north of Anchorage. It contained Drano and a shovel, materials intended to speed the decomposition of a body and to dig a grave. Investigators believe Keyes had prepared this cache in May 2011 when he staked out the North Fork trailhead with the intention of abducting someone from the area. He told the FBI he did not take a victim from this location. The second cache was found near Blake Falls Reservoir in Parishville, New York, deep in the Adirondack wilderness. It was the cash that had been moved there after the Currier murders. Stowed in a watertight bucket, it contained a .22 caliber Ruger pistol with the stock removed to make it more concealable, empty magazines, ammunition, and a silencer. These were items Keyes had originally buried near the Curriers' Vermont neighborhood 2 years before the murders. After killing Bill and Lorraine, he had moved the remaining contents to this new location in New York, disposing of the weapons used in the actual crime by throwing them into the reservoir. Investigators also found evidence suggesting that Keyes may have maintained additional caches in other locations. He told the FBI about a cache near Green River, Wyoming, containing guns and money. Another may have existed near Port Angeles, Washington. And in 2024, the discovery of the kit at the Bonnet Carré spillway, corroborated by a civilian witness, an FBI travel timeline entry, and a map with markings found on Keyes' personal computer, expanded the known geography of his operations even further. The unsettling reality is that there may be more caches out there, buried in forests and fields and along riverbanks across the continental United States. There may still be waterproof buckets packed with weapons and chemicals and rope, left there by a man who died more than a decade ago, slowly degrading but still present, waiting to be discovered by a hiker or a hunter or a curious child. The FBI has asked the public to report any such discovery immediately and not to touch the contents. Now picture a map of the United States with pins marking every location where Keyes is known to have traveled between 2004 and 2012. The FBI released such a map after his death, and it is staggering in its scope. There are pins in nearly every region of the country: Alaska, Washington, Oregon, California, Wyoming, Texas, Louisiana, New York, Vermont, New Jersey, Arizona, New Mexico, even Hawaii. He also traveled to Canada and to Mexico. He took roughly 36 documented trips during that 8-year period alone, many of them by air. And on each trip, he rented a car and drove hundreds or sometimes thousands of additional miles, creating a web of movements that covered virtually the entire lower 48 states. His operational security was extraordinary by the standards of serial crime. He used cash whenever possible. He disabled his cell phone or left it at home before traveling to commit a crime, so there would be no cell tower records placing him at the scene. He avoided using his own vehicle. He studied FBI profiling techniques and criminal investigation methods, deliberately designing his approach to defeat them. He had read Mindhunter, the landmark book by FBI profiler John Douglas, as a young man, and he kept dozens of books about murders, both fiction and non-fiction, in his home. He reread the Dean Koontz thriller Intensity multiple times and closely identified with the serial killer antagonist. He studied the cases of Ted Bundy, Dennis Rader, and others, not out of idle fascination, but to learn from their mistakes. He admired Bundy. He told investigators he felt he shared similarities with him. Both were methodical. Both felt a sense of possession over their victims. He once attempted to imitate Bundy's courtroom escape and was immediately seized by guards. But he also studied the killers who had been caught and catalogued the reasons why. He viewed Rader, the BTK killer, with contempt, calling him a wimp for apologizing in court. He reserved his admiration for the ones who, in his words, haven't been caught. What Keyes did differently from nearly every serial killer in the FBI's database was this. He had no victim type. He did not target a specific gender, age, race, or physical description. He chose victims of opportunity. people who happened to be in isolated or vulnerable locations at the moment when he had decided to act. He waited for people in campgrounds, in parking lots, in cemeteries, on hiking trails, at late-night businesses, places where a person might be alone, with no witnesses nearby. Not as much to select from. He told investigators about these locations. But there's also no witness. There is nobody else in the area. He preferred strangulation because, as he told the FBI, he derived pleasure from watching victims lose consciousness. He said he would use a gun only when he had to. And here is perhaps the most important thing to understand about his method. He planned his crimes the way someone might plan a long vacation. He would identify a general area. He would fly in, sometimes stopping to visit family along the way to create an alibi. He would rent a car. He would drive to the vicinity of a buried cache. He would retrieve his supplies. He would scout locations where he might find someone alone. And then he would wait for the right moment. The time between burying a cache and using it could be months or years. The distance between his point of origin and his target could be thousands of miles. The victim could be anyone. This is why the FBI's profiling tools failed. Those tools are designed to find patterns. They look for geographic clusters of crime, for victim commonalities, for behavioral signatures that repeat from one offense to the next. Keyes left none of that. He was, in the language of criminal profiling, an omnivore, a designation so rare that it barely existed in the literature before his case. FBI Special Agent Jolene Gooden, the case agent who would come to know Keyes' methods more intimately than almost anyone, would later put it plainly. He didn't really have remorse. He didn't have empathy. And when asked about what drove him, she said, he enjoyed it. He liked what he was doing. Keyes funded his travels through bank robberies. He committed at least several, using some of the same planning discipline he applied to murder. He would case a bank in advance, choose one in a town he had no connection to, and rob it wearing a disguise. The cash went into his murder kit caches or was used to cover travel expenses. Investigators have confirmed at least 2 of these robberies, though Keyes admitted to more. All of this, the caches, the cross-country flights, the rental cars, the cash from bank robberies, the disabled cell phones, the study of investigative technique, created a system that was almost invisible to law enforcement. There was no way to connect a missing person in Vermont to a construction worker in Alaska. There was no way to link a buried bucket of weapons in the Adirondacks to a couple who vanished from a ranch house in Essex Junction. Every crime was an island surrounded by thousands of miles of empty road and careful planning. And for more than a decade, it worked. Let's talk about what we know and what we don't know about the years when Israel Keyes was hunting. After his honorable discharge from the army in July 2001, Israel Keyes settled into life on the Makah Reservation in Near Bay, Washington, with his girlfriend and their infant daughter. Near Bay is at the very tip of the Olympic Peninsula, as far northwest as you can go in the contiguous United States without falling into the Pacific Ocean. It's a small, isolated community, home to the Makah people, surrounded by temperate rainforest and rugged coastline. The nearest city of any real size is Port Angeles, about 70 miles to the east along winding 2-lane highways. Seattle is a 5-hour drive and a ferry ride away. It is, in other words, the kind of place where a person can exist quietly on the margins of society without drawing much attention. Keyes worked for the Makah Tribal Council, a steady, unglamorous job in a community that valued reliability. He was building what, from the outside, looked like a stable, if unremarkable life. He had a partner, a young daughter he appeared to care about, employment, a place to live. He wasn't wealthy, and he wasn't visible. He was just a guy living in a small town in the far corner of Washington state. Beneath that surface, investigators believe, the killing began. There is a particular quality to the forests of the Olympic Peninsula that anyone who has visited them will understand. They are massive and ancient and impossibly dense. Sitka spruce and western hemlock and Douglas fir trees tower hundreds of feet overhead, their trunks thick with moss. The understory is so lush that in many places you can't see more than 20 feet in any direction. The forest floor is soft with decomposing plant matter. Rain falls nearly every day during the wet season, which in this part of Washington stretches from October through May. Everything is perpetually damp, perpetually green, perpetually hidden. These are the forests where Israel Keyes lived. These are the forests where he told the FBI he killed people. Keyes told investigators that he committed his first murder in 2001, shortly after leaving the army, though he refused to identify the victim or provide any details that might lead to identification. He described the period between 2001 and 2005 as one in which he killed at least 2 people in Washington state, a couple, though he would not say whether they were married or what their relationship to one another was, or anything about their ages, their appearances, their names, or the specific circumstances of their deaths. He said they were buried in a location near a valley. He hinted that he may have moved their vehicle to a location some distance away to complicate any investigation. We don't know who they were. That is a sentence that recurs again and again in the Israel Keyes case, and each time it carries the same weight. 2 human beings were taken from this world somewhere in the state of Washington, and their families may not even know what happened to them. They may have been reported missing and investigated as runaways or victims of accidents, or people who simply chose to start over somewhere else. Their case files may still be sitting in a sheriff's office somewhere in a filing cabinet, growing dusty, classified as cold and unsolved, waiting for a connection that may never come. Think about what that means for the people who loved them. A spouse who waited for them to come home. A parent who called their phone over and over, listening to it ring and ring. A child who asked when mommy or daddy was coming back and never got an answer. These are people who have been living with that uncertainty for more than 20 years now, and who may never learn the truth. Between 2005 and 2006, during the summer and fall months, Keyes admitted to committing 2 additional murders in Washington state, independent of each other. He described these as separate incidents involving separate victims. For at least one of these, he used his boat, a small vessel he kept for fishing and recreation, to dispose of the body, towing it out onto Lake Crescent in Olympic National Park and sinking it in more than 100 feet of water, using anchors to keep it submerged. You're standing at the shore of Lake Crescent on a summer morning in 2006. The surface is glass. The surrounding peaks of the Olympic Mountains are reflected perfectly in the water, their snow-capped ridges doubled in the stillness. Hikers pass by on the Spruce Railroad Trail, which winds along the lake's northern shore. Families pull into the parking lot at the Lake Crescent Lodge for a weekend getaway. Kids throw rocks into the shallows. A kayaker glides past, barely making a ripple. Nobody has any reason to think that somewhere beneath this serene, postcard-perfect lake, in the deep, cold water that rarely gives up what it takes, a person's remains are resting on the bottom, weighed down by anchors, placed there by a man who drove here from the other side of the peninsula for that exact purpose. FBI Special Agent Ted Haller later visited this lake with a CBS News crew. He had a boat, Haller said. We know that he took it out on this lake along with some of the other lakes in the area. He revealed to us that one of the Washington state victims was actually their body was sunk in this particular lake. In total, Keyes claimed responsibility for the deaths of 4 people in Washington state between 2001 and 2006. None of them have been identified. Investigators reviewed unsolved homicide and missing persons cases throughout the region following Keyes' confessions, but the randomness of his victim selection and the remoteness of his body disposal methods have made confirmation extraordinarily difficult. Have you ever wondered how many missing persons cases in Washington, in Oregon, in New York, in states all across the country might be connected to one man who nobody was looking for? How many cold case files might contain the answers to questions that Israel Keyes could have answered but chose not to? How many families have spent years staring at their phones, waiting for news, not knowing that the person responsible for their pain was eventually caught for an entirely different crime in an entirely different state? There are cases that have been publicly discussed as possible Keyes victims, though none have been confirmed. And it is important to be careful about the distinction between confirmed facts and speculation. Speculation can hurt families. It can create false hope or redirect investigations. So what follows should be understood as cases that investigators and researchers have examined in light of Keyes' known presence in particular areas, not as confirmed connections. Julie Marie Harris was 12 years old when she disappeared from Colville, Washington on March 3, 1996. She was waiting for a ride to a local church. She was a Special Olympics medalist in skiing and a double amputee whose prosthetic feet were found by the Colville River about a month after she vanished. Her remains were discovered in a wooded area nearby in April 1997. Keyes, then 18, lived in the area at the time and would have been familiar with the terrain. After his arrest in 2012, he was questioned about Julie's case. He neither confirmed nor denied involvement, saying only that he had heard about that. Julie Harris was 12 years old. She was a child. She had won medals in the Special Olympics. She had friends and a church community and people who were waiting to give her a ride that afternoon. Her murder remains unsolved to this day. In 1997, 12-year-old Cassandra Emerson was reported missing in Colville after the remains of her mother, Marlene K. Emerson, were found in their burned-out trailer home. Cassie's remains were later discovered about 13 miles away. Keyes admitted that his first act of arson involved a trailer in Colville. For years, he was considered a possible suspect, but in December 2024, a man named Charles Tatum was arrested in connection with the Emerson murders, apparently resolving that particular case. The speculation extends to other unsolved cases as well. The shooting deaths of Mary Cooper, 56, and her daughter Susanna Stodden, 27, who were killed while hiking in Washington in 2006, have been discussed in connection with Keyes, though no definitive link has been established. The disappearance of Lauren Spira, a 20-year-old Indiana University student who vanished on June 3, 2011, just 5 days before the Currier murders in Vermont, has drawn attention given that Keyes was driving through the Midwest and Northeast at exactly that time. Again, no confirmed connection exists. To be fair to the investigators working these cases, the nature of Keyes' crimes makes definitive identification extraordinarily difficult. He chose victims at random, which means there was no relationship to trace, no motive to uncover, no connection between killer and victim that could lead investigators from one to the other. He disposed of bodies in locations specifically chosen to prevent discovery: deep lakes, remote forests, areas far from roads and trails. He crossed state lines constantly, which means that cases in different jurisdictions may never have been cross-referenced. And the information he provided to the FBI, while tantalizing, was deliberately incomplete. What we do know is that in 2007, Keyes made a significant change in his life. He relocated from Washington to Anchorage, Alaska, taking his daughter with him. He had separated from his daughter's mother around 2004, and by 2007, he had begun dating a woman named Kimberly Anderson, a nurse practitioner. He moved in with her and started a construction business called Keyes Construction. By all external measures, the business was legitimate and well regarded. He did foundation work, carpentry, remodeling. His clients trusted him. His co-workers remembered him as skilled, reliable, and hard-working. Several people who worked with him described him as a devoted father, who frequently talked about his daughter and clearly cared about her well-being. In Anchorage, Keyes built the outward life that would serve as cover for the next 5 years of murder. He had a girlfriend, a child, a business, a home in the Turnagain neighborhood, a residential area of West Anchorage where houses sit on large lots with trees and space between them. He went to parent-teacher conferences. He played with his daughter. He did foundation work and carpentry for clients who invited him into their homes and saw nothing to be alarmed about. Kimberly Anderson, his girlfriend, was a nurse practitioner. She was by all accounts unaware of what Keyes was doing during his frequent trips. She saw a hard-working man who sometimes traveled for business, who was good with his hands, who adored his daughter. She lived with him and shared a home with him and slept beside him at night without any indication that the person next to her was capable of the things he had done and would continue to do. When the truth finally emerged in 2012, the betrayal she experienced was of a magnitude that most people cannot fathom. The person she had trusted with her daily life, with the safety of her home, had been someone else entirely. And between the jobs and the family dinners and the school pickup and the weekend fishing trips, he boarded planes and disappeared into the lower 48 states to retrieve his buried weapons and find someone to kill. Between 2007 and 2012, the FBI's timeline shows that Keyes took dozens of trips across the country. Some were to visit family in Indiana, Maine, or New York. Some appeared to be work-related, and some, investigators believe, were to commit crimes. Separating the innocent trips from the deadly ones has been one of the most challenging aspects of the entire investigation, because Keyes was meticulous about blending legitimate travel with criminal activity. A trip to see his mother in Indiana might include a detour through Vermont. A flight to visit his brother in Maine might include a rental car driven 1,000 miles out of the way through states where he had no known connections. And this is where the timeline breaks down into fragments and shadows, into trips that investigators can document but cannot fully explain, into windows of time during which terrible things may have happened but cannot be proven. Keyes told the FBI he killed a woman in April 2009 in New Jersey and buried her body near Tupper Lake in upstate New York. The town of Tupper Lake sits in the western Adirondacks, surrounded by wilderness, lakes, and logging roads. It is the kind of place where you could bury something and be reasonably confident that no one would find it for years, if ever. The FBI believes the victim of this crime was Debra Feldman, a 49-year-old resident of Hackensack, New Jersey, who was last seen alive on April 8, 2009, at her home. Her remains have never been recovered, and her case remains technically unsolved, though investigators have expressed what they describe as relative confidence in the connection. The years between 2007 and 2011 may contain other victims. Keyes hinted at more without providing details. He played games with the information during his interrogation, offering enough to keep investigators engaged, but never enough to identify anyone with certainty. He was aware that the information was his currency, the only thing keeping the FBI at the table and willing to negotiate on his behalf for conditions like protecting his daughter from media exposure. And he doled it out in carefully measured increments, always retaining more than he gave. In May of 2011, something happened that would set the stage for what came next. Keyes staked out the North Fork trailhead in Eagle River, Alaska, a popular hiking area north of Anchorage, with the intention of abducting someone from the trail. He had prepared a nearby cache containing Drano and a shovel, which he planned to use for body disposal. He told the FBI he did not take a victim from this location, though we have only his word for that. The trailhead is popular with families and solo hikers. The idea that someone was sitting in a car in that parking lot, watching people walk into the forest, deciding who to follow, is the kind of detail that changes the way you think about the places you go and the strangers you pass. 1 month later, in early June 2011, he boarded a plane to Chicago and began driving east, which brings us to Essex, Vermont. On June 2, 2011, Israel Keyes flew from Anchorage to Chicago. He rented a car at the airport, a nondescript sedan that would draw no attention on the highways of the Midwest and the Northeast. He told the FBI he was planning to visit his brother in Maine, but the route he took tells a different story. Instead of driving directly east, he meandered. He stopped in Indiana, possibly to visit his mother. He drove through New York, and somewhere along the way, the purpose of the trip shifted. Or perhaps it had been the purpose all along. When Keyes reached the Burlington, Vermont area, he retrieved the murder kit he had buried near the Curriers' neighborhood roughly 2 years earlier. Think about what that means for a moment. 2 years before the night of the murders, on a completely separate trip, Keyes had driven through this quiet Vermont suburb, found a secluded spot, and buried a waterproof container filled with zip ties, ammunition, firearms, silencers, Drano, duct tape, and other supplies. He had marked the location in his memory, possibly on a map, and then he had gone home to Anchorage and resumed his life as a father and contractor. For 2 years, that cache sat in the ground, waiting. The cache contained everything he would need. No purchases at local stores, no credit card receipts, no surveillance footage of him buying weapons. Everything had been placed there in advance, with the patience and planning of someone who understood that the greatest risk to a criminal is the trail of evidence created in the hours and days immediately surrounding a crime. Now picture a quiet residential street in Essex, Vermont, in the first week of June 2011. The trees along the road are lush and fully leafed, Fireflies are starting to appear at dusk. Screen doors are propped open to let in the warm evening air. Somewhere down the street, a dog is barking at a squirrel. The Curriers' ranch house sits among its neighbors, its lights visible from the sidewalk, their car in the driveway. It's the kind of street where children play in the front yard until they're called in for dinner, where people leave their porch lights on for each other. On the night of June 8th, a little after midnight, Israel Keyes approached the Currier home on foot from a nearby hotel where he had been staying. He moved through the darkness of the residential street, dressed entirely in black, wearing a headlamp that he kept off until he reached the house. He cut the phone line to their home. He entered through the attached garage, likely through a side door, and made his way into the kitchen. He later described what happened next as a blitz attack, sudden, overwhelming, designed to incapacitate the residents before they could react or resist. It took only seconds. Bill and Lorraine woke in their bedroom to find a stranger standing over them. A man dressed in black, his face obscured, a gun in his hand, the beam of a headlamp cutting through the darkness of their room. In one moment, they were asleep in their own bed, safe in their own home, and in the next moment, everything they had built was gone. He bound their hands with zip ties. He searched the house, calmly asking them questions about their possessions. Did they have a safe? Where were their ATM cards? Did they own a gun? Lorraine had kept a handgun in the house for protection. Keyes found it and took it, along with their cell phones. Then he forced both of them out of their bedroom, through their own kitchen, into their own garage, and into their own car. He drove them to an abandoned farmhouse on the outskirts of town that he had scouted earlier, a place he had identified as suitable for what he intended to do. The farmhouse was empty, isolated, and far enough from other homes that no one would hear anything. What happened at that farmhouse is difficult to describe without lingering on detail that would serve no purpose other than to amplify pain that already exists. So here is what is known, stated as carefully and respectfully as possible. Keyes shot Bill Currier. He then sexually assaulted Lorraine Currier and strangled her. Bill and Lorraine fought. Chittenden County State's Attorney T.J. Donovan would later say the Curriers fought to the end. They did not go quietly. They resisted in whatever way they could, even bound, even in the dark, even facing a man with a gun who had been planning this moment for years. Their courage deserves to be acknowledged. In a moment of absolute helplessness, they fought for each other. That says everything about who Bill and Lorraine Currier were. After the murders, Keyes disposed of the couple's bodies. Their remains have never been found, despite extensive searches of the property and surrounding areas. Keyes provided some information during his interrogation about where he may have left them, but the abandoned farmhouse where the murders occurred was demolished at some point, complicating any recovery effort significantly. Investigators excavated the property but found nothing. Whether the bodies were moved before the demolition, or whether they were buried in a location Keyes never fully disclosed, remains unknown. And so, more than a decade later, Bill and Lorraine Currier's family has never been able to lay them to rest. Keyes moved most of the contents of his murder kit to a new hiding spot near Blake Falls Reservoir in Parishville, New York, deep in the Adirondack wilderness, more than 100 miles from Essex. He disposed of the weapon he had stolen from Lorraine and the gun he had used to shoot Bill by throwing them into the reservoir, ensuring that the firearms used in the crime would be separated from the crime scene by a significant distance. He cleaned up everything. He drove away from Essex. He covered his tracks with the same discipline he had applied to every previous crime. And then he continued east, driving through New England before eventually circling back to Chicago and flying home to Anchorage. On June 15, 2011, just 1 week after taking the lives of 2 innocent people in Vermont, Keyes flew from Chicago to San Francisco. He stayed 1 night. He returned to Anchorage the next day, and he resumed his normal routine as if nothing had happened. Contractor by day, father in the evenings, the man who built decks and poured foundations and drove his daughter to school and had dinner with his girlfriend. Nobody in Anchorage had any reason to suspect a thing. Meanwhile, in Essex, the investigation into the Currier's disappearance was consuming the local community. Vermont State Police, the Chittenden County State's Attorney's Office, and local agencies mounted a comprehensive search. They canvassed the Currier's neighbors, some of whom had lived on the same street for years and could not fathom what might have happened. They spoke with Bill and Lorraine's co-workers, who confirmed that neither had given any indication of planning to leave or of being in any kind of trouble. They examined the house, which showed clear signs of a forced entry and a struggle, but offered frustratingly little in the way of forensic evidence pointing to a specific individual. There were no security cameras on the street. No witnesses reported seeing or hearing anything unusual on the night of June 8th, which was remarkable in itself, given that Keyes had cut the phone line, broken into the garage, and removed 2 people from the house. In a neighborhood where houses sit relatively close together, the entire event had been conducted so quickly and so quietly that not a single person had noticed. The days turned into weeks. The weeks turned into months. Tips came in as they always do in missing persons cases, and each one was investigated, and each one led to a dead end. The community held vigils. Local media covered the case extensively. People speculated about what might have happened. Had the Curriers run into financial trouble and fled? Had they been targeted by someone they knew? Had they simply chosen to disappear? None of those theories held up under scrutiny. The Curriers had not been in financial distress. They had no known enemies. They had no history of marital problems or mental health crises. They were, by every measure available to the people investigating their disappearance, exactly what their friends and family said they were. A quiet, kind, stable couple who had no reason to vanish. And that is what made the case so maddening for the investigators who worked it. When someone disappears, and there's no motive, no suspect, and no obvious trail, the investigation enters a kind of limbo. Every avenue of inquiry requires starting from nothing. There's no thread to pull, no door to kick in, no person of interest to interview, just an empty house and 2 missing people, and a community that is growing more frightened by the day. The Chittenden County State's Attorney's Office assigned additional resources. Detectives from neighboring jurisdictions offered assistance. The case was discussed at regional law enforcement conferences. Analysts reviewed sex offender registries and recent parolees in the area, looking for anyone with a history of violent crime who might have been in Essex that week. They pulled toll booth records and gas station receipts, trying to identify unfamiliar vehicles passing through town. They reviewed surveillance footage from every business with a camera within a 5-mile radius of the Currier home, looking for anything out of place. Nothing connected. Nothing led anywhere. The Curriers had vanished as completely as if they had never existed, and the man responsible was already back in Anchorage, pouring concrete foundations and taking his daughter to school. It had been 10 months since Bill and Lorraine had been reported missing. Vermont State Police Officer Lance Burnham later said, describing the long, agonizing stretch before any break in the case materialized. That break, when it finally came, would not emerge from the investigation in Vermont. It would come from 4,000 miles away, in Anchorage, Alaska, where a completely different crime by the same man would unravel the entire double life Israel Keyes had built. And the connection between a missing couple in Essex and a missing barista in Anchorage would only become clear because Keyes himself, sitting in a jail cell, chose to reveal it during months of interrogation. And this is where the story takes a turn that nobody expected. It was February 3rd, 2012, and the temperature in Anchorage had dropped well below freezing. The sky was dark by mid-afternoon, as it is every February in Alaska, and the city had that particular winter feel, headlights reflecting off packed snow, exhaust rising from car tailpipes at traffic lights, the sound of tires crunching on ice. Along Tudor Road, between a Home Depot and a stretch of other businesses, the lights of the Common Grounds espresso stand glowed against the darkness. It was a Wednesday evening. Samantha Koenig was working the closing shift, alone in the kiosk, the way she had dozens of times before. Tudor Road is a busy 4-lane road in Midtown Anchorage, the kind of commercial corridor you'd find in any mid-sized American city. There's a Walmart nearby, a Lowe's, fast food restaurants, gas stations. It's not an isolated area. Cars pass constantly. People walk to and from the stores. The espresso stand itself was positioned where drivers could pull up, order, and pull away in a few minutes. Dozens of people probably drove past the Common Ground stand that evening without a second thought. Israel Keyes had been watching this coffee stand. He had driven past it multiple times, noting the layout, the hours, the traffic patterns. He had considered other espresso stands in Anchorage, but chose Common Grounds because of its position on the road, because the adjacent parking lot offered a place to wait out of direct view, and because it stayed open later than most other stands in the area. He had never seen Samantha Koenig before. He did not know her name. He told investigators he chose the location, not the person, and that he simply assumed a young woman would be working alone at closing time. That evening, around 8 o'clock, Keyes approached the stand and ordered an Americano. Security camera footage, later released by the FBI with permission from the Koenig family, shows what happened next. Samantha made the coffee. Keyes then produced a gun. The footage shows Samantha raising her hand several times. At one point, Keyes instructed her to turn off the light inside the stand. The light switch was located near a panic button, but Samantha did not press it. Investigators believe she was too frightened. Keyes climbed into the kiosk, used zip ties to bind Samantha's hands behind her back, and led her out to his white Chevrolet pickup truck, which was parked across the street in a Home Depot parking lot. Surveillance footage from the Home Depot shows the faint, distant images of two figures getting into the white truck. The entire abduction took about 12 minutes. Approximately 15 minutes later, the security camera at Common Grounds recorded Samantha's boyfriend, Dwayne Tortolani, arriving to pick her up. He walked around the stand once, then drove away. Samantha's cell phone, still inside the kiosk, can be seen lighting up in the footage as calls and text messages come in from her boyfriend and her father. Nobody answers. Keyes drove around Anchorage with Samantha in the truck. He told her he was planning to hold her for ransom. Samantha told him her family did not have much money. Keyes said he expected the public would donate to a reward fund. He drove her to his home in the Turnagain neighborhood, where his girlfriend and 10-year-old daughter were not present at the time. He locked Samantha in a shed in his backyard. The FBI later described the courage Samantha Koenig showed in the final hours of her life. She cooperated with Keyes' demands. She gave him the PIN for her debit card. She remained calm in circumstances that are almost impossible to comprehend. She was 18 years old, bound in a stranger's shed in the middle of an Alaska winter night. And she conducted herself with more composure than most adults could summon under similar conditions. In the early hours of February 2nd, Israel Keyes sexually assaulted and strangled Samantha Koenig. She died within hours of her abduction. He left her body in the shed, in the backyard of his own home, yards away from where his daughter slept. And then he went on a cruise. This is one of the details of the case that is hardest to comprehend, not because it is the most violent, but because of what it reveals about the way Keyes compartmentalized his existence. He had a pre-booked 2-week cruise in the Gulf of Mexico with his girlfriend and his 10-year-old daughter. It had been planned for weeks, possibly months. The tickets were purchased, the bags were packed, and on February 2nd, 2012, the same day Samantha Koenig was killed, Israel Keyes left Anchorage and boarded a cruise ship. For more than 2 weeks, he was at sea. He went to ports of call. He ate in the dining room. He sat by the pool. He took his daughter to the kids' activities. He lived the life of a man on a family vacation while, back in Anchorage, a dead woman lay in his backyard shed and an entire city searched desperately for her. During those 2 weeks, the search for Samantha Koenig intensified. Anchorage police and the FBI were working the case aggressively. Surveillance footage from the Common Ground stand had been recovered, showing a man in dark clothing approaching the kiosk and leading Samantha away. The white pickup truck was visible in the Home Depot parking lot footage, but the images were grainy, the distance was significant, and the man's face was not clearly visible. He had planned the lighting conditions of the abduction carefully. The footage was released to the public. It aired on local news stations. It was shared on social media. People across Anchorage studied the grainy images, trying to identify the man in dark clothing, trying to make out the license plate on the white truck, trying to find anything that might lead to Samantha. Tips flooded in by the hundreds. Each one was followed up on. Each one led to a dead end. The man in the footage had no identifiable features, no distinguishing clothing, no visible face. He could have been anyone. Meanwhile, Samantha's family and the community of Anchorage were holding on to hope. James Koenig, Samantha's father, pleaded publicly for her return. The reward fund swelled as people contributed money, believing it might be used to secure her release. Local businesses posted her photo. Volunteers searched parks and neighborhoods. The community was united in its belief that Samantha was still alive, and that if they did enough, raised enough, looked hard enough, she would come home. None of them knew that the person responsible was 4,000 miles away on a cruise ship in the Caribbean, sitting in a deck chair, watching the ocean go by. When Keyes returned to Anchorage on approximately February 17th or 18th, he went to the shed. What he did there is among the most disturbing details of the case, and it should be stated carefully and without embellishment, because the facts themselves are sufficient. He applied makeup to Samantha's face. He sewed her eyelids open using fishing line so that her eyes appeared to be open. He positioned her body and propped her up so that she appeared to be alive. He placed a copy of the Anchorage Daily News dated February 13th, 2012 against her body and held it there with his own hand while he took a Polaroid photograph. The newspaper was intended to serve as proof of life, to convince anyone who saw the photo that Samantha was still alive as of that date. This is one of those details that is almost impossible to absorb when you first hear it. The deliberateness of it, the patience required, the complete absence of anything recognizable as human empathy. He spent time preparing this photograph the way a photographer might prepare for a portrait sitting, adjusting the lighting, positioning the subject, choosing the props, except the subject was a young woman he had murdered 2 weeks earlier, and the prop was a newspaper, and the purpose was to extract money from a family that was already in agony. She was not. She had been dead for more than 2 weeks. This photograph was the ransom demand. Keyes photocopied the Polaroid, and on the back of the copy, using a manual typewriter he had purchased specifically for this purpose, so that the note could not be traced through handwriting analysis, he typed a ransom demand for $30,000 to be deposited into Samantha's bank account. He then placed the note and the photograph in Connors Bog Park, a local dog park in Anchorage, hidden under a memorial flyer for a dog named Albert. Using Samantha's cell phone, he texted her boyfriend, telling him in substance to look for the ransom note under Albert at Connors Bog Park. Anchorage police recovered the note. They examined the photograph. They shared it with the Koenig family. And the family, looking at what they believed was a recent photo of their daughter, believed she was still alive. James Koenig and the family scraped together $5,000, every dollar they could find, and deposited it into Samantha's bank account. They did this because they believed it would bring their daughter home. In the days that followed, Keyes dismembered Samantha's body. He drove to Matanuska Lake, a quiet body of water located along the Glen Highway between Palmer and Wasilla, about 40 miles northeast of Anchorage. The lake was frozen solid. He cut a hole in the ice using a chainsaw and placed her remains beneath the surface. Then he covered the hole. The ice would refreeze. By the time anyone thought to look there, the surface would show no sign of what had been done. And then he began using her debit card, first in Anchorage, then in Arizona, then New Mexico, then Texas. The card pinged at ATMs and businesses along Interstate 10 as Keyes traveled east. And this is where his system, so meticulously designed to prevent exactly this kind of tracing, broke down. Because for the first time in over a decade of killing, Israel Keyes had committed a crime in his own city. He had taken someone from his own neighborhood, and then he had used her debit card, creating a trail of electronic breadcrumbs that led investigators directly to him. Every rule he had built for himself, every protocol he had designed to stay invisible, he had broken. No random victim selection in a distant state, no cash-only transactions, no clean separation between his identity and the crime. He had killed a woman a few miles from his own house and then used her bank card with his own face visible on ATM cameras, however disguised. Why? Investigators have debated this question extensively. Some believe Keyes had grown reckless after years of killing without consequence, that the same arrogance that led him to go on a family cruise hours after committing murder had finally metastasized into genuine carelessness. Others believe the ransom scheme itself represented a kind of experiment, a new thrill on top of the killing, an additional layer of control over the victim's family and the investigators who would eventually be looking for her. Others have suggested, more speculatively, that some part of Keyes wanted to be caught, that the double life had become unsustainable, and that the mistakes were not entirely accidental. We may never know the answer. What we do know is that the debit card trail was the thread that unraveled everything. The FBI and Anchorage police were monitoring Samantha's debit card activity. When the withdrawals began appearing across the southern United States, they knew her abductor was on the move. They tracked the card through multiple states, watching the trail move east along Interstate 10 through Arizona, into New Mexico, and then into Texas. Each ping brought them closer. Each withdrawal narrowed the search area. You're an FBI agent sitting in a field office in Anchorage in late February and early March of 2012. You've been watching this debit card trail for weeks now. You know the person using it is almost certainly the person who took Samantha Koenig. Every time the card hits an ATM, you get a location. Surveillance footage from those ATMs shows a figure in a hood, sunglasses, and a face covering. Someone who is deliberately trying to avoid being identified by the cameras. But the trail itself is unmistakable. The card is moving east, steadily, and whoever is using it is spending money along the way. And on March 13th, 2012, in the parking lot of a Cotton Patch Cafe in Lufkin, Texas, more than 4,000 miles from Anchorage, officers pulled over a white rented Ford Focus during a traffic stop. It was a routine stop, the kind of thing that happens thousands of times a day across the country. But when officers searched the vehicle, they found an ID belonging to Samantha Koenig. They found her debit card. They found her cell phone. The driver was Israel Keyes. He was 4,000 miles from home, in a rented car, with a dead woman's belongings in the vehicle. He was placed under arrest. Corporal Brian Henry of the Lufkin Police Department took Keyes into custody. For the first time in his life, the man who had spent over a decade designing an undetectable system for murder was sitting in the back of a police car. And the case that had started with a missing barista in Alaska was about to become something much, much larger. When Israel Keyes was transported back to Anchorage and placed in the FBI's field office for questioning, the investigators in the room had no idea what they were about to uncover. They had arrested a man for using a stolen debit card. They suspected him in the abduction of Samantha Koenig. They were building a murder case against a construction worker from Alaska. What they did not yet know was that the man sitting across from them, calm and cooperative, occasionally smiling, had been killing people across the entire United States for more than a decade, that he had buried weapons in the wilderness of half a dozen states, that he had robbed banks to fund his travels, and that the full scope of his crimes might never be known. Keyes was initially charged with access device fraud, the technical charge for using Samantha's stolen debit card. He entered a not guilty plea at his arraignment in federal court on March 27, 2012, shortly after being transferred from Texas to Alaska by federal marshals. He was represented by a public defender. He was placed in custody at the Anchorage Correctional Complex. And then, in the weeks and months that followed, Keyes began to talk. It did not happen all at once. It was a process, a slow unfolding driven by a complicated dynamic between Keyes and his interrogators. He wanted things. He wanted to know his daughter was safe and that she would be shielded from the details of what he had done. He wanted assurances that his family would not be prosecuted or harassed. He wanted coffee. He wanted to know what was being said about him in the media. And in exchange for these things, he was willing to provide information, but only on his terms and only in the amounts he chose. Over the course of the next several months, investigators conducted more than 40 hours of recorded interviews with Israel Keyes. These conversations took place in a conference room at the FBI's Anchorage field office, with FBI agents, Anchorage police detectives, and representatives from the U.S. Attorney's Office present. Assistant U.S. Attorney Frank Russo was a key figure in these sessions. FBI Special Agent Jolene Godin served as the case agent. The interrogation recordings were later released publicly by the Anchorage Daily News and have been posted to various platforms. They represent one of the most extensive interrogation records of any modern serial killer. Listening to those recordings is a disorienting experience. Keyes speaks calmly, almost conversationally, about acts of profound violence. He discusses logistics and timelines with the precision of someone reviewing a project plan. He occasionally laughs. He sometimes corrects the investigators when they get a detail wrong, as if accuracy about the sequence of events matters more than the events themselves. There is no remorse in his voice, no hesitation, no indication that he understands on any emotional level what his actions cost the people who survived them. In these interviews, Keyes confessed to the murder of Samantha Koenig. He described the abduction, the assault, the killing, and the disposal of her body in detailed, clinical language. He explained his process for selecting the coffee stand, for timing his approach, for managing the logistics of the ransom scheme and the crews and the body disposal. He treated it as a series of problems he had solved, some of them well, some of them poorly. He told investigators that Samantha had shown remarkable courage, that she had been calm, that she had cooperated with his demands. The FBI would later publicly acknowledge her bravery, noting that these details are being provided both to fully explain the courage and resolve Samantha displayed in the final hours of her life. He also confessed to the murders of Bill and Lorraine Currier in Essex, Vermont. He described how he had flown to Chicago, rented a car, driven to Vermont, retrieved his buried cash, and entered their home in the middle of the night. He described the abduction, the farmhouse, and the killings. He told investigators where the cash had been buried and where he had moved it after the murders. The FBI recovered the weapons and supplies from Blake Falls Reservoir based on his directions. The Curriers' bodies, however, have never been found. Keyes provided some information about where he may have left them, but the abandoned farmhouse where the murders took place had been demolished, and extensive searches of the area yielded nothing. He also spoke about the woman he claimed to have killed in New Jersey in April 2009, whose body he said he buried near Tupper Lake in upstate New York. He provided limited details, but the FBI's investigation led them to identify the likely victim as Debra Feldman of Hackensack, New Jersey. And then there were the others. Keyes spoke of killing 4 people in Washington state, a couple between 2001 and 2005, 2 individuals separately between 2005 and 2006. He described disposing of at least 1 body in Lake Crescent. He alluded to other crimes without providing enough detail to identify victims or locations. He seemed to enjoy the dynamic of the interrogation, the back and forth, the control he maintained over what he chose to reveal and what he held back. Investigators described him as calculating even in custody. He would offer fragments of information, enough to keep the conversation going, but carefully withheld anything that would definitively identify his unknown victims. He made deals. He asked for coffee, for news about his daughter, for assurances that his family would be shielded from the fallout of his crimes. "I want my kid to have a chance to grow up," he said. "She's in a safe place now. She's not going to see any of this. I want her to have a chance to grow up and not have all this hanging over her head." That request, coming from a man who had murdered at least 11 people and left multiple families without closure, represents one of the darker contradictions of the case. He wanted protection for his own child while having permanently destroyed the lives of other people's children, parents, and partners. In his interviews, Keyes also revealed aspects of his psychology that gave investigators a window into how he thought about his crimes. He told the FBI he saw himself as two different people: the father and contractor who lived a normal life in Anchorage, and the predator who emerged when he traveled. He described the transition between these two identities as something he could switch on and off. He idolized Ted Bundy and said he felt they shared many similarities. Both were methodical. Both were heavy drinkers. Both felt a sense of ownership over their victims. He also expressed admiration for serial killers who had never been caught, viewing them as the true successes in his field. He described Dennis Rader, the BTK killer, as a wimp for apologizing during his sentencing. He said he had known since he was 14 that the things he wanted to do were not considered normal. "There were things that I thought were normal and that were okay that nobody else seems to think are normal and okay," he told investigators. "So that's when I just started being a loner." The FBI negotiated carefully with Keyes during these months, operating in a delicate space between extracting information and maintaining the conditions that kept him talking. A key part of the arrangement was that his identity would not be publicly released while he cooperated with the investigation. This was not about protecting Keyes. It was about protecting the flow of information. As long as he believed his name was not in the media, he was willing to continue providing details about his crimes, details that might eventually identify victims and bring closure to families who had been waiting for answers for years. Vermont authorities agreed to this condition, and for months the agreement held. Keyes continued to talk. He described his crimes in Washington. He discussed the Currier murders. He provided enough information about the cash in Vermont for the FBI to recover it. He spoke about his travels and his methods. And while he was careful to withhold enough to maintain leverage, the overall trajectory was forward. He was giving more than he had given before. The investigators believed that with patience, he might eventually provide the names and locations that would allow them to identify his unknown victims. But in July 2012, everything changed. A reporter named Jennifer Redding at WCAX, a local news station in Burlington, Vermont, identified Keyes by name as the suspect in the Currier murders. The story aired and spread rapidly, both within Vermont and beyond. Within hours, it had reached Alaska. When Keyes learned that his name was in the public domain, something shifted in him. The FBI agents who had spent months building a rapport with him carefully navigating his demands and his ego and his need for control, watched as the flow of information slowed to a trickle and then nearly stopped. To understand why, you need to understand what Keyes valued most, even more than his own freedom. He cared deeply and perhaps genuinely about his daughter. He did not want her to grow up knowing what her father had done. He had made this clear from the beginning of the interrogation process, returning to it again and again. Every deal, every piece of information he offered was tied in some way to the protection of his daughter from the truth about who he was. When his name entered the public record, that protection was gone. His daughter, or the people caring for her, would now be able to find out everything. And the leverage Keyes held, the information he had been trading for assurances about his family, suddenly lost its value. Why continue talking if the one thing he was bargaining for could no longer be guaranteed? FBI Special Agent Jolene Godin has spoken publicly about the frustration and the tragedy of this moment. The leak did not just compromise the investigation in a tactical sense. It may have permanently sealed off avenues of information that could have identified victims whose names the world has never known, and brought closure to families who have been waiting for more than a decade. Josh Hallmark, the podcaster who has spent years investigating the case, has expressed similar frustration. You can't help but think of what information we could have that we never will have because of that leak, he has said. He acknowledged the reporter's motivation, understanding that the Vermont community needed to know what was happening, but the cost of that knowledge was measured in silence, in questions that will now likely never be answered. The months after the media leak were marked by deterioration. Keyes became withdrawn. He attempted to escape custody at one point, reportedly trying to imitate Ted Bundy's courthouse escape before being immediately seized by guards. He was placed on closer surveillance. His interactions with investigators became shorter and less productive. On the night of December 1st, 2012, Israel Keyes was found dead in his cell at the Anchorage Correctional Complex. He had cut his wrists with a razor he had obtained or fashioned, and then strangled himself with a bedsheet tied to a structural feature of his cell. He was 34 years old. His trial on charges of kidnapping and murder in the Samantha Koenig case had been scheduled to begin in March 2013. He would never stand in a courtroom and face the families of the people he had killed. The circumstances of his death raised immediate questions. How had a high-profile prisoner on watch for suicide risk been able to obtain a means to cut himself? How had he been able to fashion a ligature and use it without being discovered in time? These questions have never been fully answered publicly, and they speak to the systemic challenges of monitoring inmates in solitary confinement, particularly those who are intelligent, patient, and determined. Beneath his body, investigators found a 4-page note written in pencil and ink on yellow legal pad paper. The note was soaked in blood and initially impossible to read. It was sent to the FBI laboratory in Quantico, Virginia, for processing. After extensive analysis, the Bureau concluded that the writings contain no hidden code, no investigative leads, no map to buried victims, and no information about additional crimes. The FBI has described the note as containing rants, but has not offered detailed commentary on the meaning of the text. The note has been made public in redacted form. Also found in his cell, hidden beneath his bed, were the skull drawings, 11 skulls, rendered in his own blood. each decorated with an inverted crucifix. They were drawn on what appeared to be a piece of paper or cardboard, carefully and deliberately. Investigators believe each skull represented a victim. There was also a 4-page note written in small, cramped handwriting. Most of it was illegible or nonsensical, a mixture of what appeared to be song lyrics, doodles, and fragmentary thoughts. The portions that could be read offered no new information about his victims and no expressions of remorse. I believe this signifies Satan and Israel Keyes, and the upside-down crucifixes on his 11 victims indicate that these are his and these stories and souls belong to him. FBI Task Force Officer Jeff Bell later said, "Whether the number 11 is accurate or whether it represents a minimum or an approximation or a fiction is something that may never be definitively established." Keyes enjoyed controlling information. It is possible that he killed more than 11 people. It is also possible that the number was precise. What is certain is that he took the identities of most of his victims to the grave, and the drawings themselves, blood on paper, hidden beneath the body of a dead man in a jail cell, were his final act of possession over the lives he had taken. Even in death, he was asserting ownership. Even at the end, the victims were props in a narrative he alone controlled. Keyes' funeral was held on December 8, 2012, 1 week after his death. It was a small, private affair. His mother, 4 sisters, and 3 brothers-in-law attended. Nobody else. There were no public mourners, no media vigils, no outpouring of grief from the community. His body was cremated. Whatever he knew, whatever names he could have spoken, whatever families he could have freed from the purgatory of not knowing, was gone. For the families of the Curriers, for James Koenig, for the people who loved Debra Feldman, and for the families of every unknown victim, his death was a second wound. The first was the loss of the person they loved. The second was the loss of any chance of learning the full truth from the only person who possessed it. In the years since Israel Keyes' death, the FBI has continued to investigate his crimes. The case has never been formally closed. Agent Jolene Godin and her team have worked with law enforcement agencies across the country, reviewing missing persons cases and unsolved homicides that might align with Keyes' known travel patterns and methods. It is painstaking, frustrating work made exponentially harder by the deliberate steps Keyes took to prevent exactly this kind of reconstruction. It's really important to us to be able to bring some type of closure to family members that are still wondering what happened to their loved ones, Godin has said. Our primary concern is identifying additional homicide victims, but we're certainly also interested in identifying other crimes that he committed because it will help us put him in a particular place in the country. The challenge is immense. Keyes deliberately chose victims at random, which means there is no victim profile to work from. He disposed of bodies in remote locations designed to prevent discovery, locations he described in only the vaguest terms during his interrogations. He crossed state lines constantly, which means the investigation requires coordination between dozens of jurisdictions, each with its own cases, its own evidence, and its own priorities. And the primary source of information about his crimes, Keyes himself, is dead. The FBI's timeline of his known movements, published online at fbi.gov, spans from 1997 to 2012 and covers hundreds of locations across the United States. At each pinpoint on that interactive map, investigators must consider whether an unsolved case might be connected to him. The timeline includes entries like these: trips to Vermont, New York, and Maine with no clear commercial or personal purpose. Flights to cities followed by car rentals and hundreds of miles of driving with no documented destination. Stays at budget motels in small towns far from any known friend or family member. Purchases at Walmart stores where Keyes frequently bought supplies for his caches. Each entry is a question mark. Each represents a window of time during which someone, somewhere, may have been taken. You're a family member of a missing person in Washington state. Your sister or your son or your neighbor disappeared in 2005, and the case went cold years ago. You've been living with that uncertainty ever since, checking your phone every time it rings, flinching every time you see a story about unidentified remains. And then you hear about Israel Keyes. You hear that he killed people in Washington state, that he admitted it, that he refused to say who. You look at the FBI's timeline and you see that he was in your area during the month your loved one disappeared. And you call the tip line and you wait and you hope that someone can finally tell you what happened. That is the reality of this case for an unknown number of families across the country. They exist in a liminal space between grief and hope, between knowing something terrible probably happened and not having the one piece of information that would let them move forward. For each of those trips on the timeline, investigators ask the same questions. Was this trip innocent? Was this a trip to visit family? Or was this a trip to kill someone? In many cases, they cannot answer. Have you ever wondered what it would be like to be a detective working this case? To have a map with dozens of pins and a suspect who is dead and can no longer tell you what each pin means? To know that somewhere in a forest or at the bottom of a lake there may be remains that would give a family closure and you simply cannot find them. The FBI has asked the public for help. They have released details of Keyes' travels, his interview recordings, and photographs of his caches and evidence. They have published his known whereabouts for every documented trip he took over a 15-year period. They have asked anyone who encountered him, who lived near the locations he visited, or who noticed anything unusual to call their tip line. The number is 1-800-CALL-FBI, and slowly, piece by piece, new information has emerged. The task that Agent Godin and her team face is unlike a typical cold case investigation. In most cold cases, there is a victim, a location, a time of death, and a limited pool of suspects. The investigator's job is to narrow down who did it. In the Keyes case, the problem is inverted. The suspect is known. The question is who his victims were. And the answer to that question is scattered across thousands of miles and more than a decade of carefully obscured travel. Consider the practical difficulties for a moment. The FBI has Keyes' bank records, his airline records, his cell phone data where available, and the information he provided in his interrogations. From these sources, they can reconstruct a timeline of his movements, but the timeline only tells them where he was on documented trips. Keyes told investigators he sometimes drove rather than flew to avoid leaving records. He sometimes paid for hotel rooms in cash. He sometimes turned off his cell phone for days at a time. The documented trips are almost certainly an incomplete picture of his actual movements, which means the real timeline of potential crime windows is even larger than what the FBI has published. For each documented trip, investigators must review every missing persons case in the area during that time window, determine whether the circumstances are consistent with Keyes' methods, and then attempt to find physical evidence connecting him to the case. In many instances, the missing persons cases themselves have limited evidence because the people vanished without a trace, which is precisely what you would expect if Keyes was responsible. He chose his victims specifically because they were in isolated situations where their disappearance would not be immediately noticed or easily investigated. The investigation has been advanced not only by law enforcement, but by the work of independent researchers, journalists, and podcasters who have devoted years to studying the case. Josh Hallmark, the host of the True Crime Bullshit podcast, which takes its name from Keyes' own dismissive reference to this true crime bullshit that people are obsessed with, has spent years retracing Keyes' movements and corroborating details from his interviews. His work, done in collaboration with his team and in communication with the FBI, led to the identification of the murder kit near the Bonnet Carré spillway in Louisiana in 2024 and has contributed significantly to the broader understanding of Keyes' travel patterns and possible crime locations. The discovery at the spillway came through a civilian who recognized Keyes from news coverage after encountering him in person in 2012. The witness had been riding a dirt bike near the spillway when a man approached and asked questions about the area, identifying himself as a tourist from Alaska. Weeks later, when Keyes' arrest made the news, the witness realized who he had spoken to. He returned to the area and found a buried bucket containing knives, rope, razor blades, and duct tape partially hidden under an abandoned deep freezer. Not only can the murder kits be found, but they can be found by average citizens who are out hiking and out recreating. Hallmark has said, the mythology of him being the most methodical serial killer of all time is turning out to be very false. That observation is important. For years, the narrative around Israel Keyes emphasized his supposed genius, his meticulous planning, his ability to outsmart every investigative tool available. And while his system was unusual and effective for a disturbingly long time, it was not infallible. He was caught because he broke his own rules. He committed a crime in his own city, in his own neighborhood, against someone who could be traced back to him. He used a victim's debit card repeatedly, creating a digital trail across 5 states. He went on a family cruise in the middle of a kidnapping and ransom scheme. These are not the actions of an infallible criminal mind. They are the actions of someone who, after years of operating without consequence, became reckless. Or perhaps someone who, on some level, was tired of the double life he was living. Maureen Callahan, the investigative journalist who wrote American Predator, the most comprehensive book on the Keyes case, spent years and roughly $30,000 of her own money fighting to access the case files through First Amendment legal channels. Her work uncovered documentation that points to potential additional victims beyond those Keyes acknowledged in his interviews. She has described Keyes as an analog killer in a digital world, someone who exploited the gaps between jurisdictions and the limitations of pre-digital era investigative tools to remain invisible for more than a decade. The FBI has also noted something significant about how criminal investigation has changed since Keyes' era. Keyes' system relied on a fundamental assumption that has eroded since his death, that physical distance between crimes equals investigative distance. In 2001, when he began killing, cross-jurisdictional communication between police departments was inconsistent at best. DNA databases were smaller and slower. Surveillance cameras were less common. Cell phone tracking was rudimentary. A killer who moved constantly and left no geographic pattern could exploit the seams between jurisdictions with relative ease. In many ways, Israel Keyes was a product of his era. He grew up off the grid and he killed off the grid, exploiting the gaps between analog systems of record keeping and law enforcement communication that had not yet been bridged by technology. His entire method was premised on the idea that a crime committed in Vermont would never be connected to a person living in Alaska, because the two places were separated by 4,000 miles of geography and dozens of independent police departments that rarely compared notes. For much of the decade during which he was active, that premise was correct. The system was not designed to catch someone who moved this way, who killed randomly, who left no pattern, who created no link between himself and his victims. Today, those seams are narrower. National databases like NamUs, the National Missing and Unidentified Person System, allow investigators to cross-reference missing persons cases with unidentified remains across state lines. NamUs was launched in 2007, 6 years after Keyes began killing and 5 years before he was caught. Had it been available and fully populated during the earliest years of his activity, it might have flagged connections between cases in different states that no individual department could have seen on its own. It might have identified patterns in the disappearances of random victims across the Pacific Northwest. It might have given investigators a thread to pull before a decade of killing had already occurred. Surveillance networks are vastly more comprehensive now than they were during Keyes' active years. Cell tower records, toll booth transponders, license plate readers, and credit card data create an almost continuous digital trail for anyone who moves through the modern world. The explosion of home security cameras, doorbell cameras, and dashcam footage means that even residential streets in small towns are now covered by overlapping fields of view that simply did not exist in 2001 or even 2011. Whether someone like Keyes could operate as long as he did under current conditions is an open question, but the answer is almost certainly no, at least not without even more extreme measures to avoid detection. And yet, the unknown victims remain unknown. That is the hardest part of this story, not the details of the crimes, as disturbing as they are, not the psychology of the killer, as unsettling as it is. The hardest part is the silence that surrounds the people who are still missing. The couple in Washington whose names we don't know, the person at the bottom of Lake Crescent, the woman whose body may be buried near Tupper Lake in the Adirondacks, the others who are represented only by blood-drawn skulls on a piece of paper found beneath a dead man's body in a jail cell in Anchorage, Alaska. Somewhere, there are families who do not know what happened to the people they love, and that absence, that unanswered question, is a kind of wound that does not close. It sits in the background of holidays and birthdays and ordinary Tuesday afternoons. It is the empty chair at the table, the phone that never rings, the conversation that never happens. And for some of those families, the Israel Keyes investigation may be the only remaining hope that they will ever get an answer. As FBI Special Agent Jolene Gordon said, and it is worth repeating here because it captures the heart of everything we've been talking about tonight. This case is about them and their lives, and the lives that they have not been able to live, and the families who no longer have them there. That's what this case is about. It's not about him. I try not to focus on him, and so we won't either. Let's end where this story should always end, not with the man who did these things, but with the people he took. Samantha Koenig was 18 years old. She was born on August 30th, 1993, in Anchorage, Alaska, to James and Darlene Koenig. She had 5 siblings who loved her. She had a boyfriend who drove to pick her up from work on the night she disappeared and found an empty coffee stand with her phone lighting up inside, call after call going unanswered. She had a father who deposited $5,000 into her bank account because he believed his daughter was still alive and that the money might bring her home. She had dreams of becoming a Navy nurse, of building a career that combined service with compassion. She worked hard. She took jobs at fast food restaurants and motorcycle shops and espresso stands, not because she loved the work, but because she understood that the life she wanted required effort, and she was willing to put it in. She served coffee to strangers on dark winter evenings in Alaska. She made plans for the future. She texted her dad. She came home to a dog and a cat who were happy to see her. She was a person who deserved every single one of the years that were stolen from her. Her remains were recovered from Matanuska Lake on April 2nd, 2012, by the FBI's Underwater Search and Evidence Response Team. The lake sits along the Glen Highway between Palmer and Wasilla, surrounded by mountains and birch trees, the kind of scenery that draws tourists every summer. A memorial plaque dedicated to Samantha and all of Keyes' victims is located on a gazebo at Matanuska Lake. It is a quiet place now, a place where people sometimes stop and read the words on the plaque and think about an 18-year-old who made coffee and had plans and deserved to grow old. Bill Currier was 50 years old. Lorraine Currier was 55. They were married. They lived in Essex, Vermont, in a ranch house on a quiet street where they had built a life together over many years. They liked staying home with their pets. They liked the rhythm of ordinary days, work in the morning, dinner in the evening, television, sleep. Bill worked for a local moving company. Lorraine worked at a hospital. They were, by every account, friendly, kind, and private. The kind of neighbors who wave when you drive past and who would help you shovel your driveway without being asked. On the worst night of their lives, they fought for each other. They resisted. They did not go quietly. And that should be remembered as clearly as anything else in this story. In a moment when they had every reason to give up, they held on to each other. That is who Bill and Lorraine Currier were. Their bodies have never been found. Their family has never had a funeral. There is no headstone. There is only the memory of 2 people who loved each other and who deserved to grow old together in that quiet house in Vermont. You want to know something about the kind of people the Curriers were? In the weeks after they disappeared, when the investigation was at its most intense, and the community of Essex was consumed with fear and uncertainty, the people who came forward to speak about Bill and Lorraine had nothing but good things to say. Not a single person offered a negative memory. Not a single coworker had a complaint. Not a single neighbor had a grievance. In a world where it is easy to find someone willing to say something unkind about almost anyone, the Curriers were universally described as decent, generous, and kind. That kind of unanimity is rare. It tells you something about the quality of the lives they were building together, quietly, without any need for recognition or praise. Debra Feldman was 49 years old. She lived in Hackensack, New Jersey. She was last seen alive on April 8, 2009, at her home. The FBI believes she was killed by Israel Keyes, though her remains have not been recovered and her case remains technically unresolved. We know almost nothing about who Debra was beyond these basic facts: what she loved, what she was good at, what she hoped for, who missed her most when she was gone. And that absence of detail is its own kind of loss, because every person deserves to be remembered for more than the circumstances of their death. Debra Feldman lived in a world full of people who knew her. She had a neighborhood. She had a daily routine. She had a front door she walked through every morning and every evening. She had a mailbox where letters arrived with her name on them. She had a place in the world that was hers, and that place has been empty since April of 2009. Somewhere, there are people who remember her laugh, who remember the way she took her coffee, who remember the last conversation they had with her without knowing it was the last one. Those memories deserve to exist alongside the facts of her case, because Debra was more than a case file number. She was someone. She mattered to the people who knew her, and she deserved better. And then there are the unknown. At least 7 more people, possibly more, whose names have never been spoken in connection with this case. People who had birthdays and best friends and favorite songs and plans for the weekend. People who left for work one morning, or went for a hike one afternoon, or stepped outside their home one evening and were never seen again. They may have been someone's parent, someone's child, someone's closest friend. They may have had a wedding coming up, or a baby on the way, or a retirement they'd been counting down to. We will never know, because the man who took them refused to tell anyone who they were. And then he died before he could be compelled to. Think about what it means to be a family member of one of those unknown victims. You don't even know that your loved one is connected to this case. You may have filed a missing person report years ago and spent every day since then wondering, waiting, imagining scenarios that range from hopeful to unbearable. You may have driven the same roads 1,000 times, looking for a car you recognized or a face you might have missed. You may have stopped celebrating holidays the way you used to, because there is always an absence at the center of every gathering that nobody can fill. And you may never learn the truth, because the only person who knew it chose to take it to his grave. That is perhaps the cruelest part of this entire case. Not just the violence itself, but the silence that followed. The deliberate withholding of information that could have brought closure to families who are still, to this day, waiting. Keyes treated that information as leverage, as currency, as something that belonged to him. And when he died, he took it with him. Because behind the case file, beyond the headlines, underneath the theories and the FBI timelines and the interrogation transcripts, were real people. People who laughed too loudly at their own jokes. People who worried about their kids. People who called their mothers on Sunday evenings. People who fed their pets before they fed themselves. People who fell asleep on the couch watching television and didn't bother to move to the bed. They were not characters in a true crime story. They were someone's whole world, and they deserved better than what happened to them. So tonight, as you sit with this story, maybe remember these people not for how they died, but for the fact that they lived, that they were here, that they mattered. Samantha, who made coffee and dreamed of becoming a nurse and had her entire life ahead of her. Bill and Lorraine, who loved each other and their pets and their quiet life on that street in Vermont. Debra, who left for work one April morning and never came home. And the ones we cannot name, who existed just as fully, just as meaningfully, even if we will never know their stories. Somehow, that feels like it should have been enough to keep them safe. The ordinariness of their lives, the goodness of their routines, the simple act of being a person in the world, going about your day, expecting to come home at the end of it. It should have been enough. And the fact that it wasn't, for these people, is a reminder that the world is sometimes unbearably unfair, and that the least we can do is remember the ones who were lost. We started this story more than 2 hours ago with a young woman making coffee in a small espresso stand in Anchorage, Alaska, on a cold February evening. We've traveled through forests in Washington and farmland in Vermont and interrogation rooms in Alaska and courthouses and lakes and highways and the places where terrible things happen to people who did nothing to deserve them. And through all of it, the thing that has mattered most is not the methodology of the man who did these things, or the cleverness of his planning, or the scope of his travels. The thing that has mattered most is the people he took. They were here. They were real. They had plans and routines and people who loved them, and they did not get to see those plans through. If there is anything useful to take from a story this painful, it may be this. Pay attention to the people around you, not because the world is full of predators, but because it is full of people who matter, people who deserve to be noticed and valued and remembered, and because the ordinariness of their lives is not a small thing. It is the whole thing. It is everything. If you or someone you know has information about unsolved missing persons cases that may be connected to Israel Keys, the FBI asks that you contact them at 1-800-CALL-FBI or submit tips at fbi.gov. Talk tips. Families are still waiting. The investigation is still open. And every piece of information, no matter how small, has the potential to give someone an answer they have been waiting years to receive. Their stories are still unfinished, and someone, somewhere, knows why.